This story is more than 30 years old now, and in light of the concussion settlement today between the National Football League and its retired players, it is time for the story to be told, I believe for the first time. It is the story of Doug Kotar. The NFL will award $675 million as compensation to players who suffered cognitive injury or to the family they left when they died, some by their own hand. There will be $75 million more for baseline medical exams, another $10 million for research and education, and absolutely zero admission by the NFL that it ever withheld medical information or even that any of these traumas occurred while these men played football. And no admission that the NFL could have done better for Doug Kotar. It is that obscure, forgotten name that puts into context exactly what has been going on all these years behind the scenes. But it also underscores that it has been going on that long and that NFL players were trying to get something done about severe head injuries, at least as far back as 1982. That was the year one of the most acrimonious labor disputes in world sports history. The NFL Players Association went on strike after the Monday night game on September 20th. It wasn't settled until November 16th. In between, the two sides fought as hard as any two teams of players ever had. Each side tried to sabotage the owners' hotels and news conference arrangements. The owners tried to bypass the union and lure individual star players back across the picket line. A pro-owner writer went on national TV and called the head of the union a communist. And the federal mediator walked out at one point, saying there was nothing more he could do. And the untold part, in the middle of a meeting, one of the player reps got up and threw himself, literally across the bargaining table at one of the owner's negotiators. He had to be restrained by several men. He told me flat out he had wanted to kill the negotiator for what the man had just said. That is part of the story, but it's only the middle. The beginning is about a New York Giants running back named Doug Kotar. He hardly looked the part. He was a shade under 5'11", and he had done almost nothing in college at Kentucky. And he was an undrafted free agent. And 5 days after the Pittsburgh Steelers signed him that way in 1974, they had had enough of him, and they traded him to the Giants. And while some of the other Giants would suggest that he looked like a bowling ball, they would just as willingly also note that he played like one, lead with the head and just keep rolling. Kotar lasted 8 improbable seasons in the NFL. He ran for 3,380 yards. And when he retired, he was the team's 4th all-time leading rusher. He is still 8th. He racked up more yards than Tuffy Lehmans and Eddie Price and Rob Carpenter. And on the day he quit, the opening day of the Giants' 1982 training camp, he was only 229 yards behind Frank freaking Gifford. Except he didn't really quit. If you're that size and you play that long and you lead with your head, you are going to get hurt. As the talk of another player strike swamped everything else in the NFL that spring and summer, Doug Kotar limped into camp in '82, tried to make his knee and shoulder work, and then gave it up and told everybody he was going home to play with his kids. He had just turned 31. The rest of what I know about this is what I was told in confidence by members of the players' union negotiation team in 1982 and the years thereafter. During some downtime, one of his suddenly ex-Giants teammates went to see Kotar, and Kotar said he'd been having these dreadful headaches. Out of nowhere, he said. He thought it must have happened while he was playing in the pool with his kids when one of them maybe kicked him in his head. Several weeks passed, the ex-teammate said, but the headaches did not pass. The ex-teammate and his family convinced Doug Kotar to check into a local hospital in Newark, New Jersey, for what was still a fairly rare thing then, a CAT scan of his brain. That is when they found the tumor. It was about the size of a golf ball, and it certainly didn't happen because he'd been kicked in the head by a child 3 weeks earlier. In those days, before MRIs, the only option was to open up his skull and use the term that is even more frightening now than it was then, exploratory surgery, for 8 hours. 8 hours, a month into his retirement, 10 weeks after his 31st birthday. And the surgeons did not remove the tumor. It was malignant and so awfully placed in the brain that to attempt to remove it would, in all likelihood, kill Doug Kotar. And by this point, before any of the treatments that would follow, Doug Kotar's savings had already been all but wiped out. And at this point, the union, about 5 weeks away from striking and maybe ending the 1982 season, asked the NFL Management Council, the labor arm of the owners, for help for Doug Kotar. By this point, Doug Kotar had already become a symbol to the union of why they were ready to go on strike. Yes, they wanted a fundamental realignment of how the game's vast millions would be distributed. They wanted 55% of the gross revenues. That's why their chief, Ed Garvey, had been called a communist by that sports writer. Today, collective bargaining agreements in most sports begin with the owners offering the players a percentage of the gross, on occasion more than just 55%. But the football players of 1982 were striking also for Doug Kotar, or at least for all he represented. Because if what was happening to Kotar was the result of an injury on the field, the collective bargaining agreement that was already in place then guaranteed that his medical expenses would be paid for him. There was just one problem, a problem that rendered that guarantee meaningless. Even with an inoperable brain tumor, even with the money disappearing before his eyes, Doug Kotar could not get a hold of his medical records from his 8 years with the New York Giants. That same collective bargaining agreement gave him no right to see the results of his physicals, no right to have an outside doctor or lawyer review any treatment for any of his endless injuries, no way to know if something had been missed or somebody could have known. And that's when the union asked the owners for help. He's dying. He's already bankrupt. He has an 8-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl. He has a brain tumor in a sport in which guys like him have to lead with their head. I had been covering the negotiations since March. It was now late August, and at the start of one of those days of negotiation, the players and the union officials, whom I'd come to know very well in those 5 months, did not give me their usual friendly greetings. They brushed past me, their eyes fixed ahead of them, and several had reddened faces. And one of the officials, registering my fear that I'd offended somebody somehow, lingered a moment. "It's not you. We heard back about Doug." What the union had heard was this. Since there was no proof that Doug Kotar had ever sustained any kind of head injury while he was in the NFL, they wouldn't pay him a dime beyond what they absolutely had to. And since he had retired, the NFL said, because of his shoulder and knee problems, the league would be happy to help him with any medical bills for his shoulder and for his knee. His head, his fatal tumor, as far as the league was concerned, since that was diagnosed after he had retired, it had happened after he had retired. There would be no insurance money. There would be no exception. The weeks passed, the strike was called, the negotiations moved from New York to Washington, to New York to a place called Cockeysville, Maryland, back to New York, back to Washington. And one day that same union executive looked at me grimly and said, "Doug is paralyzed partially. They're moving him to a facility outside Pittsburgh where he grew up. Nobody's saying it, but he has almost no chance." On one of those days in Washington, maybe it was the same day, one of the endless, pointless, fruitless hotel meetings between the owners and the players ended abruptly. The players and the owners' representatives scattered. I finally found 2 of the players near an escalator far away from the hotel's main lobby. The bigger player was shaking. The slighter one, whom I had covered when we were both in college, waved me over. "Tell him," he told the bigger player while pointing at me. The bigger player, I'll call him Paul, was breathing heavily. "You know I have a law degree, right?" he asked almost rhetorically. "I mean, I'm a football player, but I also have a genuine education and a profession, and I've never done that before. 6 months of this blank with those blanks in there, and the most I've ever done was laugh at them." And then he mentioned the son of a very famous football figure, and he asked me if I knew that that man was one of the owner's reps. We'll call him Steve Jr. And then Paul started shaking again and told the slighter player to pick up the story. "We were talking about our demand," he said, "that the new agreement include our right to see our own medical records. They've resisted and resisted and resisted and never explained why. And now Paul here says, explain it." And Steve Jr. looks at him and laughs and says, "Why the hell should we let you see your medical records? All you guys are too stupid to even know what they mean." That's where the player lawyer had thrown himself literally across the bargaining table at one of the owner's negotiators. He had to be restrained by several men. Paul now interrupted his own colleague. "That," he said to me, "is when I tried to kill him." He took a long, deep breath. "I wanted to kill him because of Doug Kotar." The paralysis broadened and the radiation continued and the debt piled up. The strike was settled. The union got a little something to help the Kotars with some of the bills. I never did find out if that came as part of the deal or just out of the players' coffers. And the next August, 1983, the Giants were in Pittsburgh, and Harry Carson took 45 players and coaches and front office people to see Doug Kotar. And despite everything else, he was alert, and he went home from the hospital for long stretches, and he wanted to know what plays they were going to run. And when Carson promised to come back and visit in December, he meant it and expected Kotar to be there. The Giants ended their 1983 season in Washington on a Saturday. Carson was flying to Pittsburgh on Monday to go see Doug Kotar. And on the night of the 15th, the chief of neurosurgery at Montefiore Hospital in Pittsburgh thought it was safe enough to say, "We're hoping to get him home for Christmas." He would also say it was kind of a sudden thing. Throughout the night, he had been pretty good. The quotes were in Kotar's obituary in the New York Times. The man who wrote it was named Frank Litsky, and he was one of the reporters I'd come to know because he too covered that strike, the strike that very few of us knew was in surprisingly large part about Doug Kotar and brain injuries and access to records. On the morning of the 16th of December 1983, a day before the Giants took the field in D.C., 17 months after his retirement and 6 months and 5 days after his 32nd birthday, Doug Kotar died. So I heard of this settlement today and I thought of Doug Kotar. And when I think of what this settlement might mean for future Doug Kotars, I am gladdened. But when I wonder how many Doug Kotars there have actually been, I am terrified. And when I wonder what might have happened if this settlement had been reached not in 2013, but in 1973, I am very sad indeed.